Chapter 2: The Period of Modern Sightings. The evidence that something is being seen in the skies by reliable witnesses is overwhelming. For nearly 80 years, what is often described as the period of modern sightings, eyewitnesses have been giving accounts of their experiences which include very similar details. As a result of Freedom of Information applications and subsequent government admissions, there have been at least 2 major military investigations in the United States since 1945, and a similarly large one conducted by the French government. The results of these investigations have not been fully disclosed, and as we shall see, there is a great deal of evidence that suggests that the UFO phenomenon is a paranormal in nature, beyond the expertise of those examining it. The official story about UFOs began in 1933 when sightings were reported in Scandinavian newspapers of what were called ghost ships. In the same year, there were some sightings, too, in Britain, and eyewitnesses described strange aircraft circling low over the ground, often in poor flying conditions, emitting powerful beams of light as though searching for something. The result was that on the 28th December 1933, the 4th Swedish Flying Corps started an investigation to find out what was happening in their airspace. In the following year, Major General Ruderswärd issued a statement to the Swedish press in which he stated, "There are many reports from reliable people which describe close observations of the enigmatic flyer. The question is, who or whom are they, and why are they invading our air territory?" Despite the efforts of the Swedish military, the mystery was never solved. On 1st February 1934, the Times newspaper reported that one of these objects had been flying over London for 2 hours with many witnesses. Such was the seriousness of the event that 4 days later the Under-Secretary of State for Air, Sir Philip Sassoon, was forced to make a statement about it in the House of Commons, claiming that it must have been a Royal Air Force craft, despite the RAF being forbidden to fly at less than 5,000 feet over London. Also, the sightings often took place in conditions which would have been extremely treacherous for aeroplanes to fly in. On the 25th February 1942, there occurred a sighting of something over Los Angeles that resulted in nearly 1,500 rounds of anti-aircraft shells being fired into the sky from ground forces. This was just 3 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, and many people were still jumpy. Air raid sirens were set off, and the city shut out its lights. No U.S. Air Force airplanes were sent to intercept the attack, and according to the Herald Express, many thousands of people watched the shells exploding without effect on whatever hovered over the city. Eventually, the object flew slowly down the coast, taking 20 minutes to cover 20 miles before witnesses said it disappeared. The subsequent investigation sent a report to President Franklin Roosevelt that said the sightings must have been some kind of aircraft, but could not explain how or why it had not been brought down by the shelling. The event is said to have caused great panic amongst the LA population, and a number of people were reported to have died from heart attacks. During the Second World War, there were many reports from Allied air crews of small spherical objects that flew around them as they made their bombing runs. The bulk of sightings occurred from 1943 to 1944 and were so common that crews nicknamed the objects Foo Fighters. The possibility that the Germans had developed a new technology was taken seriously by military officials, and in 1943, Lieutenant General Massey led a British team to investigate what the pilots were witnessing. It was concluded that since no harm or interference with the Allied airplanes was taking place, they must be some form of psychological operation. Massey eventually realized that the German crews were experiencing the same encounters and that the Germans had themselves set up an investigation. The small objects behaved as though their movement was being controlled, coming close to aircraft, flying alongside, and then departing at great speed. In 1946, there were thousands of reported sightings of what were called ghost rockets in Finland, Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. The sightings then spread to many other countries, including Greece and Italy. The objects were described as being rocket-shaped and making maneuvers no known aircraft could accomplish. Cases were particularly common in Sweden again, which led to the U.S. Embassy there sending a telegram on 11th July 1946, which stated, "For some weeks there have been numerous reports of strange rocket-like missiles being seen in Swedish and Finnish skies. One landed on a beach near Stockholm without causing any damage, and according to press, fragments are now being studied by military authorities. Local scientists on first inspection stated it contained organic substance. Missiles observed made no sound and seemed to be falling rapidly to Earth. No sound of explosion followed, however. Swedes profess ignorance to origin." The Swedish General Staff described the situation as extremely dangerous, and there were public statements made that suggested the Soviets must have been testing some new weapon. Sweden requested assistance from Britain and the United States to deal with what was happening, but still no explanation could be found. Eventually, the Norwegian General Staff instructed all Norwegian newspapers to stop reporting on what was happening in the hope of reducing public anxiety. On the 6th September 1946, the Daily Telegraph published a photograph of one of the objects which showed that the entity was within the flame trail rather than at the head of it, leading Swedish authorities to conclude that it was an unknown form of technology. Even dismissing many sightings as natural phenomena, the Swedes admitted that over 200 of the objects had been tracked on radar. In the same year, on the 5th September, the Greek Prime Minister Saldaris publicly acknowledged that many objects had been seen in the skies over Macedonia and Salonika, and a team of Greek scientists was tasked with explaining them. The leader of the investigation was the respected engineer Professor Paul Santorini, designer of the fuse for the atomic bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima. On the 24th February 1967, Santorini addressed the Greek Astronautical Society and said of the investigation, "We soon established that they were not missiles. But before we could do any more, the Army, after conferring with foreign officials, ordered the investigation stopped. Foreign scientists flew into Greece for secret talks with me." When the UFO researcher Raymond Fowler contacted Professor Santini to confirm the newspaper reports that he had made this statement, Santini not only confirmed it, but added that he believed that, quote, "a world blanket of secrecy surrounded the UFO question." One of the most famous incidents in UF history was the one that took place in Roswell, New Mexico in 1947. On 2nd July, numerous witnesses claimed to have seen a bright disk in the sky heading northwest. Witnesses claimed that the object crashed about 75 miles north of Roswell, where a rancher named William Brazel, with his son and daughter, found the wreckage. The case has always raised suspicions about government involvement because of what happened when Brazel contacted the authorities. Major Jesse Marshall, the Staff Intelligence Office of the 509th Bomb Group Intelligence Office at Roswell Field Air Force Base, was sent to recover what could be found, and the base issued a statement under the authority of its commanding officer, Colonel William Blanchard, which said that wreckage from a flying disc had been located. Orders were given to fly everything that had been recovered on a B-29 to Wright Field in Daytona, Ohio, for further examination. General Roger Ramey quickly took charge of the operation and ordered everyone involved to give no further information to reporters. While the second statement was being issued to the press, which claimed that the wreckage was nothing more than a weather balloon, the crash site was stripped of every fragment that could be found, and everything was kept under armed guard at Wright Field. Major Marshall was shut away for a week following the incident, but later said that one piece of the wreckage could not be bent or marked even with hammers. Marcel was a pilot with the 468 hours of combat flying with multiple medals for shooting down German airplanes during the Second World War, and yet it was now being claimed that he couldn't distinguish between a weather balloon and a crashed disc. He went on to achieve the rank of lieutenant colonel and was assigned to a special weapons program, suggesting that his integrity was not questioned by his superiors. Despite claims from others that there was a second crash site and that bodies were found there, Marcel always dismissed this and said he saw no evidence of any of this. One of those intrigued by the Roswell incident was the nuclear physicist Stanton Friedman, who went on to interview 92 people involved with the supposed crash, 30 of whom claimed to be direct witnesses. The story consumed Friedman, who has gone on to write and debate the UFO phenomenon to this day and has dedicated his website to the exposure of what he considers the truth of what is happening. 10 of Friedman's interviewees claimed the Roswell object was non-terrestrial, and many have argued that a government cover-up is taking place. UFO sightings often come in waves, such as in 1952 when there were so many that briefings were sent from the Armed Forces Security Agencies, a version of the National Security Agency in its day, to the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the CIA. The sightings reached a peak when, on 19th July, UFOs were seen over Washington, D.C. by many airline crews, and the objects were tracked on radar at air traffic control at Washington National Airport. Pilots described seeing the objects cruising at around 100 miles per hour before disappearing at incredible speeds. In 1985, a USAF intelligence report was finally released concerning the appearance of UFOs over Washington on 26 July 1952. It states, varying numbers, up to 12 simultaneously, of unidentified targets on Air Traffic Control Center, Washington National Airport radar scope. Radar operators said there could have been other unidentified targets on their scopes outside their area of control. All ARTC crew members were emphatic that the unidentified returns were solid. Unidentified returns have been picked up from time to time over the last few months, but never in such quantities over such a prolonged period. Further waves continued to arrive, such as in 1965 when U.S. naval and air attaches reported that newspapers were describing many sightings in South America. Attaches also reported on direct sightings by aircrew, such as the pilots of Chilean National Airlines Flight LAN 904 on 6 September. The captain of the flight, Marcelo Cisternas, watched it for nearly a quarter of an hour, claiming that it was constantly emitting intense changing colors. Such series of multiple sightings have continued, as in Brazil in 1973 and again in 1986 when the Brazilian Defense Center went to its highest level of alert when radars were filled with unidentified objects that were causing major disruption to ordinary air traffic. 3 Tiger jets were sent from Sao Paulo, and reported chasing glowing objects that kept changing colors, but were too quick to intercept. The president of Brazil, José Sarney, decided to release news of the sightings to the public, and Air Minister Brigadier Otávio Julio Moreira Lima assured reporters at a press conference that Brazilian radar had not malfunctioned and that whatever had been detected was real. Waves of sightings have occurred in such numbers around the world that it would take up too much space to list them here. Observers have begun to notice patterns of where sightings take place, such as the large number around Puerto Rico since 1987, and as a result, all kinds of fanciful theories have developed, ranging from underground alien bases to theories about ley lines the various energy fields that surrounded the Earth. As we shall see, this is one of the key dangers in the subject of UFOs. Unanswered questions leave people filling the gaps with whatever their imagination can create, and as people's involvement grows, their fantasies can become more dangerous. Before considering how governments have responded to the sightings, there are two specific cases we should include. The first occurred at Rendlesham Forest in Suffolk, England in 1980. Colonel Charles Halt was deputy commander of a U.S. unit based at RAF Bentwaters, and on 26 December, Air Force Security reported sightings of strange lights. Halt has since gathered testimonies from RAF radar operators at Bentwaters and nearby Wadisham Airfield, confirming that they tracked an unidentified object that night. At around 3 in the morning, the security patrol reported seeing strange lights descending into the forest. Thinking an aircraft might have crashed, the officers investigated the site and found a glowing metallic object. One of the men, Sergeant Jim Peniston, said that as they tried to approach the object, it lifted away from them through the trees, causing local farm animals to go into a frenzy. Peniston reported the object as being a craft of unknown origin. The following day, men were sent out from the base and found 3 small marks in the ground where the object had been. They also reported finding branches of trees burned and broken along the trajectory of the object. Colonel Halt then led a group of servicemen to make further observations, during which he made a live recording on a cassette recorder. While they investigated, they saw 3 bright lights which hovered above them for 2 or 3 hours and seemed to beam down lights to Earth. The case has gathered attention because under the Freedom of Information Act in 1983, access was given to a memorandum sent by Halt to the Ministry of Defense describing what he and his men had seen, leading to a front-page story in the News of the World. In 1984, a copy of the recording made by Halt on the night was released to UFO researchers by Colonel Sam Morgan, who had taken over as the U.S. senior officer on the base. In June 2010, Halt signed a notarized affidavit claiming the event he had witnessed was extraterrestrial and that both the UK and US governments were deceiving their citizens over UFOs. It was later discovered that though the UK Ministry of Defense publicly dismissed the story, they had in fact kept a large file on the incident and were clearly far more interested or concerned than they had admitted. As awareness of the story has grown, so too have the number of attempts to debunk it, including personal attacks on Colonel Halt and dismissive accounts on the BBC. Despite the front page coverage in the News of the World, many of the airmen have stayed silent about the incident out of concern for their careers. Since they are all now past retirement age, some have begun to tell their stories. Colonel Halt has recorded their accounts and taken his evidence to promote the story in public presentations. The case of Commander David Fravor has received a lot of attention as a result of the naval officer giving a number of interviews throughout 2019. Commander Fravor's story has a lot of credibility because of his background and experience. He flew for 18 years in the U.S. Navy, was awarded every military flying qualification possible, and became commanding officer of the Black Aces. Like many accounts, Commander Fravor's experience was captured on the jet's targeting recorder by one of his crew. On 14th November 2004, his squadron was flying off the coast of Mexico in a training exercise involving an aircraft carrier as well as a number of support ships. What Commander Fravor was not told was that for the previous 2 weeks, the USS Princeton had been tracking unidentified objects dropping from the sky into that area. Up to a dozen objects were coming down from about 80,000 feet to 20,000 feet, where they would remain for a few hours before climbing vertically at speeds no known vehicle could achieve. In fact, describing them as coming down from this height is a little misleading, since this is simply the maximum height they could be tracked at. Fravor and the other men involved believed that the objects were coming from beyond the Earth's atmosphere. At around noon, Commander Fravor was about to engage in the planned exercise when he was contacted to abort on the grounds that he had to investigate the presence of something beyond the flight area of the exercise as they flew out to sea. Fravor was informed for the first time of the radar sightings of the unidentified objects, which he was now being instructed to examine. As they approached the target, Fravor recalls how calm the sea looked except for white water where there was something disrupting the surface. He describes it as looking like a cross shape that was around the size of a 737 jet, around 40 meters long and 35 meters wide. As this drew his attention, he noticed a cigar or tic-tac shaped object that was around 12 meters in length, which was just above the surface of the water. The pilot of one of the other jets confirmed over the radio seeing the same thing. The object was moving back and forth along the lines of the shape under the water, but was creating no disturbance in the water beneath it. Commander Fravor describes its movements as looking like a ping-pong ball bouncing back and forth. Fravor left the other jet that was accompanying him at 20,000 feet and flew down to take a closer look. As he slowly descended, the object changed direction and began to ascend. His impression was that it was reacting to his own jet's presence and seemed to turn towards him. As he circled just 2,000 feet above it, Fravor decided to turn directly towards it to see how close he could get to it. He was within half a mile of it when, within a second, the object vanished. The jet above him confirmed that it had vanished from their view too. Commander Fravor then turned back to investigate whatever was beneath the water, but discovered that this had also disappeared. After reporting what had happened, the squadron headed back towards the east when the radar on the USS Princeton informed Fravor that the object had reappeared back along their original flight path. It had traveled approximately 60 miles in 30 seconds. The radar operator confirmed that he hadn't tracked the object moving to its new location. It had simply appeared there. The squadron made 2 sweeps of the area without finding the object, and so returned to the aircraft carrier. News of what had happened had spread amongst the ship's crew, and as the Super Hornet was about to take off, the pilot insisted he would use his more sensitive tracking equipment to try and find it. The Super Hornet is able to identify a point on the radar and focus its different sensors on that object, which allows different forms of filming to be synchronized. As the 2-man crew flew out, they located the UFO, but as weapons operator tried to lock the radar in on it, they found their radar being jammed. This was not a malfunction in the jet's equipment. They were able to determine that some form of radar disablement was being used on them. The weapons operator immediately switched to his targeting equipment and was able to video the object as it hovered. The video is now available on the internet and shows the flight information as well as the object being observed. In the infrared mode, the footage shows that there was no heat plume, which means it was not using any conventional means of propulsion. A jet engine creates a hot plume of gas. Even in black and white TV mode, the video shows no kind of exhaust coming from it. All the time, the radar was unable to identify the range of the object, meaning it continued using some means to actively jam the jet's equipment. As the jet continued to approach, the object suddenly shot out of the camera's view at a speed Commander Fravor describes as being beyond anything our technology is capable of. Even as it sped away, the object created no exhaust trail. With the ability to observe an aircraft up to 50 miles away, it is remarkable that within a second the object could no longer be seen. Commander Fravor says the story was never classified in any way. None of the air crew were instructed to remain silent, and the video footage was never confiscated. All crew and tapes were subjected to a debriefing, and the video was copied and archived by the Navy. Fravor admits that interest in the event has meant that for most people, his entire flying career, consisting of over 5,000 hours in the air, has been reduced to that 5 minutes off the coast of Mexico. He has since talked to other pilots who have witnessed similar objects and has discovered that off the east coast of America, the sightings are quite common. There are even accounts of airplanes nearly colliding with the objects. Consequently, when radar operators spot them, a warning notice is issued to pilots flying in the area. Commander Fravor presents a story that is supported by multiple radar operators as well as a number of pilots and weapons operators. Therefore, it is clear that this is not the result of a problem with technology or a single eyewitness lying or being mistaken. He says he has been invited twice to Washington, D.C. to talk about his experience with what he will only describe as high-level government officials. The other pilot involved in the incident has been summoned to the Pentagon numerous times and claims to have been asked to compare her sighting with what other pilots have reported. As a result of the exposure the Tic Tac incident has received, it has been revealed that the United States government has been running a classified program called the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. The program was set up to study unexplained aerial phenomena, UAP, with a particular reference to sightings by military personnel. The $22 million spent on this project came to public awareness in 2017 when the U.S. government claimed that it had only been in operation for 5 years and had come to an end in 2012. As many people suspected, intelligence agencies continued to be interested in the subject, and in a 2020 State Senate hearing of the United States Senate Select Committee of Intelligence, it was disclosed that the Unidentified Aerial Phenomenon Task Force, UAPTF, is currently operating. This is run within the Office of Naval Intelligence and gathers information on what it calls unexplained aerial vehicles. The effect of Fravor has been to lead him to look at the history of technology and wonder whether many of our beliefs about what is possible are based on false assumptions. He says, if something can appear anywhere at will and do what it wants, we better give it our attention. The story raises different questions. The fact that Commander Fravor is a high-ranking military officer means different things to different people depending on the presuppositions they already have. It is argued that with his training, Fravor provides a reliable witness report, while his background suggests the exact opposite to other people who argue that sightings from military personnel cannot be trusted because any such statements would be tightly controlled by intelligence agencies, and anything he says could be part of a system of disinformation. This is one of the central difficulties with the whole subject, since there are so few hard facts that do not need some kind of interpretation. All conclusions will be highly subjective and dependent on opinion or intent. The Tic Tac incident was part of a wider release of information that received front-page coverage in the New York Times in December 2017. This was just one of a dozen stories that has now appeared in the Times over recent years. While the Pentagon has officially acknowledged the existence of UAPTF and the possibility of unknown aircraft flying in and around U.S. airspace, it appears that there is no great concern about it amongst government or military officials, and the news gained little reaction from the general public. Reports on ABC News and CNN picked up on the story, and Brett Baer on Fox News claimed, quote, a lot of people are taking this revelation seriously. But beyond the groups already captivated by UFOs, it seems the news made little impact on anyone. The New York Times stated in its article that the previous director of UAPTF was, quote, convinced that objects of undetermined origin have crashed on Earth with materials retrieved for study, end quote, and that these materials retrieved were now in the hands of both military and private groups. The Times quoted astrophysicist Eric Davis, who worked as a consultant for the program, as saying of the materials, quote, "We couldn't make it ourselves," unquote. Davis went further and said that he briefed the Defense Department in March 2017 regarding retrievals from, quote, "off-world vehicles not made on this earth," unquote. It is interesting that the release of stories and information about UFOs has led the public to a point where the New York Times can quote someone making these kinds of statements and there are no major consequences. Politicians didn't demand answers, people continued to turn up for work the following day, and a level of acceptance and normality had been established about the possibility of aliens visiting the Earth. Meanwhile, those who are suspicious of any information coming from the military question the motives for presenting the story, while at the same time appearing to do very little about it. We will now consider the reaction of various governments to these kinds of events and use them to reinforce the case that there is a real phenomenon behind it all.